When a man reaches a certain age, admiration stops being about fame and becomes a quiet reckoning with the people who shaped his inner compass. At 48, Tom Hardy is no longer proving himself to anyone. He has survived addiction, self-doubt, physical extremes, and the relentless pressure of modern stardom. He came of age watching films on worn VHS tapes in an era when actors didn't chase visibility, they disappeared into roles and let the work speak years later. Hardy's career, built on transformation and restraint, carries the fingerprints of older masters who believed acting was not performance, but exposure. So when Tom Hardy finally names his 5 favorite actors, it isn't a casual list, it's a lifetime of observation distilled into reverence. The first name he returns to again and again is Gary Oldman, not because Oldman was loud, but because he was invisible. Hardy has spoken often about the shock of discovering Oldman's range. To a young actor studying film with the hunger of someone searching for permission, Oldman was a revelation. Here was a man who could vanish so completely that audiences didn't recognize him from one role to the next. Sid Vicious, Dracula, Lee Harvey Oswald, George Smiley, no signature, no safety net, just total surrender. What Hardy respected most was Oldman's refusal to be recognizable. In an industry that rewards repetition, Oldman chose erasure. He bent his voice, his posture, his very presence until ego dissolved. For Hardy, who would later punish and rebuild his own body for roles that philosophy became foundational, acting was not about being admired. It was about being truthful, even when that truth was uncomfortable or unglamorous. Oldman also represented survival. Behind the genius was a man who battled addiction, public collapse, and long periods of professional exile. He didn't burn out in a blaze of myth. He endured. He returned quietly. And when he finally stood on the Oscar stage decades later, it felt less like a victory lap than a quiet acknowledgement of persistence. That lesson stayed with Hardy. You can see it in the way he approaches characters who barely speak, men whose inner lives are expressed through silence and tension rather than dialogue. Like Oldman, Hardy learned that restraint can be louder than spectacle, that sometimes the most powerful thing an actor can do is disappear and trust the audience to follow. For viewers who remember when actors were judged not by interviews or headlines, but by what lingered after the credits rolled, this admiration makes perfect sense. Oldman didn't just teach Hardy how to act. He showed him how to survive the long road without losing the work itself. Soft tape hissed beneath the words, as if an old reel is still spinning somewhere in the dark. The second actor Tom Hardy holds in deep regard comes from a different kind of gravity, one forged not in transformation, but in stillness. Marlon Brando wasn't someone Hardy discovered in a single moment. He was absorbed slowly, almost unconsciously, through the cultural air of cinema itself. Hardy has described watching Brando not as an education, but as a disturbance. There was something unsettling about him, something that refused polish. In films like On the Waterfront and The Godfather, Brando didn't perform lines, he lived inside them. He mumbled, hesitated, breathed between words. He made imperfection feel sacred. For a young actor raised on the idea that greatness required control, Brando suggested the opposite, that truth lived in vulnerability. What Hardy respected most was Brando's fearlessness. Not the theatrical kind, but the kind that allows silence to sit uncomfortably in a room. Brando trusted pauses. He trusted instinct over technique. And in doing so, he changed acting forever. After Brando, realism wasn't a style, it was an expectation. That influence is unmistakable in Hardy's own work. The half-finished sentences, the physical closeness to danger, the sense that a character might implode at any moment. Hardy didn't imitate Brando, he absorbed his permission. Permission to be messy. Permission to let emotion leak instead of landing cleanly. For viewers who remember the first time Brando felt different dangerous, even you understand why Hardy still circles back to him. Brando wasn't trying to be liked, he was trying to be honest. And honesty, once seen, can't be unseen. The third name Hardy reveres carries a quieter authority, one rooted in discipline rather than rebellion. Anthony Hopkins represents the opposite pole of Brando's chaos, and that contrast is precisely what fascinated Hardy. Hopkins' work revealed itself not through explosion, but through control. His characters were meticulously shaped, every word placed with intention. Hardy has spoken about watching Hopkins as a masterclass. In preparation, the hours of study, the respect for text, the belief that craft was an obligation, not a luxury. Where Brando trusted instinct, Hopkins trusted rigor. But it wasn't rigidity. Hardy admired it was balance. Hopkins could be restrained without being cold, precise without losing humanity. In performances like The Silence of the Lambs or The Remains of the Day, he demonstrated that menace and sorrow didn't need volume. They needed clarity. That lesson mattered deeply to Hardy as his own career matured. As roles became more physically demanding, more psychologically dense, Hopkins offered a reminder that strength also lived in stillness. That an actor could command a scene simply by listening. For an audience that grew up watching Hopkins age with dignity, this admiration feels earned. He didn't chase youth, he deepened with time. Hardy's fourth choice steps slightly outside the traditional leading man archetype, but perhaps comes closest to his own instincts. John Hurt was never about dominance. He was about humanity. Hardy encountered Hurt not as an icon, but as a presence, one that carried fragility without weakness. Hurt had the rare ability to make suffering feel dignified. Whether playing outcasts, victims, or quiet observers, he never begged for sympathy. He simply allowed pain to exist. That approach resonated with Hardy profoundly. Hurt represented the courage to be small on screen, to resist the urge to assert power. In an industry obsessed with control, Hurt chose surrender. And through that surrender, he achieved a kind of immortality. Hardy learned from him that characters didn't need to win to matter. Sometimes, enduring was enough. For viewers who remember Hurt's face lined, searching, unmistakably human, this influence speaks volumes. It reminds us of a time when cinema honored vulnerability, when emotional truth outweighed spectacle. Taken together, these influences form a pattern. Hardy wasn't drawn to glamour or dominance. He gravitated toward men who respected the craft, who allowed complexity, who understood that acting was less about being seen and more about being felt. The faint hum of a distant projector lingers, as if the past is still watching. The final name on Tom Hardy's list is one he approaches with something close to reverence. Not admiration in the casual sense, but the kind that makes an actor lower his voice when speaking about another craftsman. Daniel Day-Lewis is not simply someone Hardy studied, he is someone Hardy measured himself against, quietly and privately. Hardy first encountered Day-Lewis at a time when acting still felt mysterious, almost unreachable. Day-Lewis didn't just play characters, he inhabited them so completely that the man behind the performance seemed to vanish. Roles like My Left Foot, There Will Be Blood, and Gangs of New York weren't performances so much as transformations that left a residue long after the screen went dark. For Hardy, this wasn't about technique. It was about commitment taken to its furthest edge. What Hardy respected most was Day-Lewis's refusal to compromise. He worked rarely. He disappeared between films. He rejected publicity. And when he returned, it was only for stories that demanded everything. That philosophy struck Hardy deeply. In a world that rewards constant output, Day-Lewis chose scarcity. He treated acting not as a career ladder, but as a calling that required total devotion or none at all. That influence is visible in Hardy's own choices. The long silences, the physical transformations that seem less about spectacle and more about surrender. The sense that a role has cost him something real. Hardy has never claimed to imitate Day-Lewis, but the echo is there. The belief that if you are going to step into another life, you owe it your full body and soul. For viewers who remember when Day-Lewis films felt like events, something you prepared yourself for, this admiration resonates. It recalls a time when actors didn't oversaturate the screen, when mystery was preserved, and when absence made presence more powerful. Listening to these 5 names together, Oldman, Brando, Hopkins, Hurt, Day-Lewis, you begin to understand the man making the list. Tom Hardy isn't celebrating fame or dominance. He's honoring restraint, discipline, vulnerability, and sacrifice. These aren't idols. They are coordinates, markers that guided him through a career built on risk and humility. In naming them, Hardy quietly reveals himself. A man shaped not by applause, but by observation. Not by excess, but by patience. And for those who have lived long enough to watch cinema evolve and sometimes forget itself, there is something deeply comforting in that truth. The sound fades gently, like a record reaching its final groove, waiting for the needle to lift. Listening to these names together, you realize Tom Hardy wasn't listing heroes. He was tracing the quiet influences that shaped his restraint, his patience, and his respect for the craft over applause. At 48, Hardy stands as proof that true artistry matures, deepens, and slows with time. Because the greatest performances, like the greatest influences, don't fade. They stay with us long after the screen goes dark. This revelation places Tom Hardy firmly in the lineage of actors who value depth over display, mystery over exposure, and old-school philosophy carried forward into a modern age. Acting is about being truthful under imaginary circumstances,